9 years after my best friend and my wife took everything I had, I got a 3-word text from the man I blamed for all of it. "I need your help." I said yes. That turned out to be my mistake, because the man I thought had ruined my life was the smallest problem waiting for me. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into the rest of this insane story, let's do a quick roll call. Where are you watching this from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. All right, let's get into it. The text came from Richard, my wife's affair partner, the man who bled my business dry and walked away with my life in his pocket. 9 years of silence, and then those 3 words on a Tuesday morning, like no time had passed at all. I didn't answer. I let the phone sit face down on the table and turned on the radio instead, just to hear something other than my own thoughts. Crosby Resort has filed for bankruptcy. I know how to read water. 30 years teaching men twice my size how to sit still and wait for a fish that hasn't decided to show itself yet. I can call a storm an hour before the weather service knows it exists. What I never learned to read, until it nearly cost me everything, was people. The resort sat on land I had legal water access through, an old right-of-way from the 70s. If the bank sold that land to a stranger, one signature could end the access that fed my entire business. 30 years of work, and it was about to come down to whether Richard Crosby lost everything before I did. I called it a coincidence. I was wrong. 15 years before that phone rang the bankruptcy into my life, before Richard, before any of the silences Linda got good at, there was just a dinner. You need to see that dinner before you'll understand why I opened a hallway door I already knew not to open. I built the school out of a used boat and a 5-year loan. Married a woman named Linda and trusted her the way you trust the ground under your feet. You don't think about it until it isn't there. Tom Bellamy was already in my life by then. College roommate, best man at my wedding, the guy who showed up to every version of my life uninvited and stayed anyway. He came to Sunday dinners same as Richard eventually would, except Tom had been coming for 15 years by the time Richard showed up for one. I remember one dinner, maybe 6 years into the marriage, when a fishing magazine ran a small write-up on the school. Nothing big, a page and a half. Tom raised his glass and toasted me in front of everyone, loud, generous, the whole table clapping. Later that night, helping me carry chairs back into the garage, he went quiet for a second and said, "Must be nice having something people write about." I laughed it off. I didn't hear what was underneath it. I wouldn't hear it for another decade. Then Richard showed up for a lesson, threw money at my business, and started showing up at that same table like family. I thought I'd gotten lucky. Generosity like his never comes free. It just sends the bill later, when you're not looking. I noticed things and explained them away, the way you do when you'd rather be wrong than right. Linda started getting careful about her makeup before his visits. She canceled our anniversary trip for the first time in 18 years, something about a filing deadline. I told myself I wasn't the jealous type. Then, one Tuesday, I came home early. A storm was building that the weather service hadn't caught yet, and something about the air told me to turn the boat around. I noticed the mugs on the counter first, 2 of them, not one. Then, her shoes by the door, kicked off wrong, heel over toe, the way she never left them. Then I heard it, laughing, low, from the direction of the kitchen, a kind of laugh I hadn't heard out of her in years. I stood in the hallway outside that door for longer than I've ever admitted to anyone, long enough to notice the smell of coffee she must have made for him, long enough to hear my own heartbeat over their voices. I told myself there were a dozen explanations. I opened the door already knowing there weren't. Richard had his hand on the small of her back. She saw me first, over his shoulder, and everything in her face went still before either of them said a word. "Jack, I can explain," Richard said, the 4 words every liar reaches for right before he runs out of lies. I opened my mouth and nothing came out, not because I was calm, but because no word had been built yet for what I was standing in. I didn't throw anything. Didn't raise my voice, though my hand found the door frame and stayed there until my knuckles went white. I turned around and walked out to the dock and sat there until the sun went down, and I understood, somewhere in that silence, that the man I'd been an hour earlier didn't exist anymore. What came after wasn't a montage. It was 2 years. I lost the house first. Couldn't carry the mortgage alone once Richard pulled his money and half my client list walked with him out of politeness. I lost the school's name, the one with my father's old boat painted on the sign, because the bank owned the building it hung on. I slept on Tom's boat shed floor for 4 months before I could afford a bed, and there were nights I genuinely didn't know if I'd fish again because I couldn't make myself untie a boat from a dock without my hands shaking. I dated exactly one woman in 9 years. Her name was Carol. She taught 3rd grade, and she laughed at my jokes even when they weren't funny. 6 weeks in, she asked if she could come along on a Saturday lesson just to watch. I told her no, and I didn't have a real reason ready when she asked why. I broke it off myself a week later before she could see enough of me to leave first. She sent one text after that. "You didn't have to do that alone." And I never answered it. That was the cost, not a sentence. 2 years, a house, a name, and whatever part of a man it is that lets him believe someone new is safe to love. Tom was there for most of it, in a way that looked, from the outside, like the best kind of friendship. He gave me the shed. He never once mentioned the loan again after the first year. He showed up at 5 a.m. on the mornings I couldn't make myself go alone, sat in the boat without saying anything, just so I wouldn't be out on the water by myself. Some of those mornings I caught him watching the water instead of watching me, a look on his face I couldn't place, not pity, something closer to hunger, and I told myself grief was making me see things that weren't there. "Forget Richard," he told me that first week, handing me the keys. "Just forget him." He said it like an order, not comfort, and something about the force of it stuck with me longer than the kindness did. I let it go. That was my first mistake with Tom, and it wouldn't be my last. Usually there's less time between a disaster and your next mistake than you think. For me, it took 3 years. That's when a guide outfit out of state offered to buy into the school. Real money, enough to get the old name back, enough to hire staff so I wasn't teaching every lesson myself. I brought it to Tom before I signed anything, out of habit more than anything else. He listened, nodded along, and then spent 20 minutes walking me through everything that could go wrong with people I didn't know well enough to trust yet. I turned it down, told myself I was being careful. It would be years before I noticed the pattern, that every door that might have taken me somewhere Tom couldn't follow, he'd helped me close with both hands, gently, one reasonable worry at a time. 9 years of rebuilding, brick by brick, half the size, all mine. And then that text, and the bankruptcy on the radio, and no way out of going back. My lawyer's first call gave me hope. The right-of-way survives a change in ownership. His second call, a day later, took it back. Crosby had put the right-of-way up as collateral. I could win. I could also spend everything I had left finding out. I met Richard at a coffee shop by the marina. He looked worse than I expected, hollowed out, hands shaking under the table like he was hiding a tell. He needed a consultant. Investors would trust for his last project. I gave him one condition. Business only, nothing personal. "Whatever you say." He slid a contract across the table. I read every line of it twice. I wasn't handing that man anything blind a second time in my life. What I couldn't catch wasn't in what was written. Buried in the boilerplate was a single clause chaining my liability to some older document I'd never seen and couldn't chase down before my deadline ran out. I signed anyway. Walking away meant losing the water rights I'd come there for in the first place. Months later, I'd learn exactly what that clause was built to do, and that Richard, or someone standing behind him, had made sure it did it. His daughter Maya ran the numbers on the project. I'd met her before I even knew who she was. She was watching one of my lessons from behind a fence with the kind of focus that felt more like an inspection than curiosity. "I'm pricing out how much it'll cost to fix this dock," she said, "since my father thinks fishing lessons are going to save his business." "So you don't agree with your father?" "I haven't agreed with anything he's done since I was 14. That number stuck with me. 14. I asked her about it, weeks later, once we were actually talking instead of trading paperwork. Turned out, that was the year her mother found out Richard had quietly drained her college fund into a bad investment and replaced it before anyone noticed. Everyone except Maya, who noticed everything and never told her mother, because by then, she'd already decided the only way to survive her father was to become someone who caught things before they cost her anything. She became an analyst because her father taught her, without meaning to, that numbers don't lie even when people do. She wasn't in my story to move my investigation forward. She'd been running her own for 13 years before I ever showed up in it, and it hadn't been a straight 13 years either. She'd chased 2 dead ends before mine, and once accused an innocent bookkeeper of moving money that turned out to be simple misfiling, an accusation her father never once let her forget. She had a habit, I noticed later, of counting things under her breath when she was thinking hard: dock posts, coffee cups, the seconds between waves hitting the pilings. I asked her about it once, half joking. "It's the only thing that's ever actually added up the way it was supposed to," she said, not joking at all, and went back to her spreadsheet like she hadn't said anything worth noticing. I noticed anyway. It was the first time I understood that everything sharp and cold about her wasn't armor she'd put on for this investigation. It was just what was left of a kid who'd learned at 14 that nobody else was going to check the math for her. Going through the resort's books, I found out Linda was still married to Richard, still about to lose everything a second time. I expected satisfaction. What I felt instead was recognition, the particular cold of watching someone repeat a mistake you've already forgiven yourself for making once. Somewhere in that same minute I realized I didn't have it in me to hate her anymore. Not really. Hating someone takes more energy than I had left to spend on her by that point, and I'd already spent most of what I had on getting back up once. She found me a few days later, away from Richard, asking me to go easy on the numbers because she had money riding on the resort surviving. I let her wonder if I would. When we finally talked, once, briefly, she told me she'd thought money would make her happy, and it hadn't. I told her I understood. Understanding wasn't the same as forgiving, and I made sure she knew the difference before I walked away. 5 minutes. The last soft moment in this story. The transfers in the resort's accounts didn't add up. The first thread led to an account under Linda's maiden name, closed 3 years earlier. A dead end built to look like an answer. The second led to the resort's accountant, who went pale with confusion, not guilt, when I showed him the numbers. He'd been taking instructions from Richard's own email account for months without once asking where the money actually went. That night, I couldn't shake the thought that a scared man panics and shreds things before anyone official comes asking, so I drove back to the resort past midnight and talked my way past a night guard who used to fish with me on Sundays, just to get the ledgers photographed before morning changed anyone's mind about what they remembered. Tom called me that same week, like he always did when things got heavy, offering to buy me a beer and talk it through. He suggested, almost offhand, that I was wasting time on the accountant. The guy was harmless, he said. I should look higher up. I thanked him for the advice. I didn't think anything of it. Not yet. He showed up at the shed again a few days after that, unannounced, the way he'd shown up 100 times over 9 years, and stood over my shoulder while I laid the transfer records out on the table. "You're getting obsessed with this," he said. "It's Richard's mess. Let the lawyers pick it apart. You've got a school to run." "I want to know who did this to him." "Does it matter? He did it to you first. Some people just get what's coming to them eventually." He said it lightly, almost like a joke, and I laughed along with him, the way you laugh at a friend's joke without really hearing the words. I wouldn't hear them for real until much later. I brought what I had to Maya. She pulled a folder 3 inches thick out of her bag and told me to sit down. She hadn't come here to save her father. She'd spent years building a case against him for the SEC, ever since she was old enough to understand what he'd done to her mother's savings. While I thought I was working with a scared heiress, I was standing next to someone who'd been more thorough about this than I'd ever been about anything in my life. One night in the shed, we found the real chain, transfers dressed up as maintenance costs, running to an account that had never surfaced before. Maya ran the totals twice before she said a word. "This one doesn't belong to any resort expense category." She admitted, once she'd said it out loud, that she'd almost dismissed the entry the first time through. It looked enough like a vendor overpayment that she'd nearly waved it off as noise, the same kind of noise that had burned her on the bookkeeper. 3 years of chasing her own father had taught her not to trust anything that looked ordinary. The money hadn't been pulled in a panic before the bankruptcy. It had been bled out slowly, for at least 2 years. The account belonged to Tom. I didn't drive over that night. I sat with it for 2 full days, and in those 2 days, I did something I'd never once done with Richard. I got smart about it instead of angry. I called Tom and told him I was stuck. No leads, still chasing Linda's old account in circles. I wanted to see what a man does when he thinks he's still safe. He relaxed on the phone, told me to let it go for a while, come fishing instead, get my head clear. A man with nothing to hide doesn't know which doors to steer you away from. I recorded the next conversation, sitting across from him in the shed he'd given me 9 years earlier. "This is your account, Tom. You've got it wrong. It's your name, your bank, your number. That's not my money. Somebody else runs that account. You know how business works. Then whose is it? Does it matter? You got your school back. You got your life back. I made sure of that. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting." He crossed his arms, and for a second, the old Tom was back. The one who'd handed me keys and lent me money without a signature, the one I'd have believed over almost anyone else alive. You want to burn down the one relationship that survived the last 9 years over a line item? Fine. Walk out that door. See how it looks to everyone in town. You, accusing the man who kept you off the bottom of that lake. I've got the transfer records, Tom. You've got numbers. Numbers need context. I can give you 20 reasons that account exists that have nothing to do with Richard's resort. Then give me one. He stood up, paced the length of the shed once, sat back down. For a second, I thought he was going to talk his way out of it entirely. He was good at that, better than I'd ever given him credit for, spinning half-truths about consulting arrangements and shell accounts until I almost lost the thread myself. He built a story about a private loan to a mutual friend, dates that almost lined up, numbers that almost matched, and for close to a minute I felt the ground under the whole investigation start to slide. Then I asked him to name the friend. He couldn't. Not fast enough, not without a pause that gave the lie away before he finished the sentence. "You're trying to make this about jealousy," he said. "It was never that simple. Then make it simple for me." He didn't, not right away. I had to push. I brought up the toast at that dinner, the magazine write-up, the comment about chairs in the garage that I'd carried around for 10 years without understanding it. I watched something in his face give out when I said it back to him. "You think I wanted to hurt you?" I didn't say anything. "I wanted to matter as much as you did." He stopped, long enough that I thought, that's it, nothing else is coming. "Richard got to you first because I let him. Because some part of me wanted to see you knocked down to where I was." I still didn't say anything. And when it actually happened, I couldn't live with what I'd let happen, so I fixed it. He stopped again, and this time the silence went on long enough that I almost filled it myself. "I gave you the shed." A pause. "The money." Another one. 9 years of showing up at 5 in the morning so you wouldn't drown yourself in that lake. He looked at his own hands when he said the next part. "I told myself that made us even." "It doesn't. I know that now." "I did it for you," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word, "because it was easier than admitting I did it for me." That was the first true thing he'd said in the whole conversation. It didn't make it forgivable. It made it, finally, make sense. 30 years of standing next to something he wanted and never had, turned into 30 years of quietly making sure I needed him to have it. I found the rest of it the way you find most truths, sideways, in other people's words. An old college friend over the phone remembered Tom applying for the same fishing guide license I got at 26, and not getting it, and never mentioning it again. Linda, in that one honest conversation, mentioned that Tom had asked her once, years before the affair even started, whether she thought I knew how good I had it. Small things, none of them proof on their own. Together, they were the bridge I'd been missing. Envy that had nowhere to go for 3 decades, until it found a shape it could live inside and call loyalty. There was one meeting left on the resort's calendar before the bankruptcy proceedings closed its business affairs for good. The last gathering of investors and board members, held in the same conference room where Richard had once stood up and introduced Tom as the man who kept my old partner from going under. I asked to be added to the agenda. Nobody objected. By then, everyone in that room had a stake in knowing exactly what had happened to their money. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point at anyone. I set my phone down in the middle of the table, in front of all of them, and pressed play. The room went quiet in a way I'd never heard a room go quiet before. No chairs shifting, no one reaching for their water glass. Just Tom's voice, flat and small out of a phone speaker, saying the thing he'd never once said to any of their faces. I wanted to matter as much as you did. 30 seconds later, cracking on the last line he ever said to me in that shed, I did it for you, because it was easier than admitting I did it for me. I let it run the full 30 seconds and didn't say a word over it. When it ended, I picked the phone back up. Nobody looked at Tom for what felt like a full 10 seconds. He didn't try to explain himself. There was nothing left to explain to a room that had just heard him explain himself already. What I gave him in that room, what I gave all three of them, in the end, wasn't revenge. It was the truth, said once, in front of the people whose opinion they'd spent their whole lives protecting. Going to the SEC came with its own trap. Right before Maya and I walked into the investigator's office, an attorney pulled me aside and told me plainly that buried charter clause tied my consulting authority to the exact window the funds were withdrawn. Nobody was accusing me of writing it that way, but if the commission decided I'd known any part of the scheme and kept working anyway, the clause alone was enough to turn me from a witness into a defendant. Richard had built himself an insurance policy out of my own signature months before I ever knew there was a policy to build. I walked in and told them everything and handed over the recording. The room they put us in was smaller than I expected for something that was about to decide the rest of my life. A folding table, government beige walls, a window that looked out on a parking lot instead of anything worth looking at. Maya sat next to me through most of it, her hands folded on top of that same 3-inch folder, and I noticed she'd stopped counting things under her breath the way she usually did. She just sat still, which for her was its own kind of tell. They questioned Tom in a separate room down the hall, and Maya and I waited outside it for 40 minutes that felt longer than the 9 years that came before them. I kept running the shed conversation back in my head, wondering if a recording and a folder of bank transfers were actually enough, or if 30 years of a man being liked by everyone in this town would find some way to outweigh both. When they finally let us back in, the investigator told us what had happened without much ceremony. Tom had tried to buy his way out first, offering restitution in exchange for the whole thing going away quietly. When that failed, he tried 3 separate times to twist the timeline back onto me, claiming I'd known about the transfers for months, that I'd used him as a scapegoat once I realized my own name was on the liability clause. The investigator let him talk himself most of the way through it before asking one simple question. If I'd known about the scheme for months, why did the recording and evidence have Tom explaining the account to me for the first time, in real time, with no prior knowledge in my voice anywhere on the tape? Tom didn't have an answer. He sat with his mouth open for a second, the investigator said, like a man who'd built an entire argument on the assumption nobody would ever check the timestamp. Maya let out a breath next to me when we heard that part, the first sound she'd made in almost an hour, and for a second she looked less like an analyst and more like someone who'd just watched 13 years of building a case against her own father finally add up to something. Linda testified against him too, not for me. She was clear about that, just done being used by men who thought loyalty was something they were owed instead of something they earned. By then, there wasn't much of her old life left to protect. The house Richard had bought her went into the bankruptcy estate with everything else. Last I heard, she was renting 2 towns over and working a front desk, the kind of ordinary job she used to joke she'd never have to take. Nobody offered her a second act. She didn't ask for one. The investigation confirmed everything. I was cleared. Tom wasn't. Richard didn't get a redemption arc. He got a smaller, uglier version of the same ending he'd already had once. I saw him a final time on the water, the same stretch where all of this started. He told me he'd lost everything twice. You lost it twice because you built it on the same lie twice, I told him. He didn't have anything to say back to that. I heard later that he sold the boat that used to sit behind the resort's main dock, the one he used to take Maya out on as a kid, before any of this. Somebody said he cried doing it. I didn't ask if it was true. I didn't need it to be, one way or another, to know what it meant. Tom didn't fight the sentence they gave him. He asked me, through his lawyer, if I'd testify to his character. I said no. Last I heard, nobody from our old circle of friends had spoken to him since the hearing. I drove past the boat shed once, months later, out of habit more than anything. The padlock was new, the sign with his company's name gone from the door. A man spends 30 years building a reputation on being the friend everyone can count on, and it turns out that reputation only survives as long as nobody hears the recording. A few months later, I had a new group of students. Maya was one of them. She'd walked away from finance for good, said she was tired of being the only one in the room who noticed things. She cast wrong, the way beginners always do, line tangled around itself. The old me would have walked over and fixed it without thinking. This time, I waited a second before I did. "You still remember what you told me the first day?" she asked. "A fish won't bite the same lure twice." "I remember." "So a person can't either?" "He can," I said. "He just picks the lure himself the second time." She cast again. Got it right on the third try. Out past her, the water sat flat and gray and unbothered. The same water that had been there before any of this started, and would still be there after everyone in this story was gone. Tom once told me a real man doesn't need forgiveness, he needs results. I never forgave him. I never forgave Richard, and I stopped bothering to hate Linda, because hate takes more energy than she was worth by the end of it. Richard lost his empire because he got greedy. Tom lost his because he spent 30 years jealous of a man who never once asked him to compete. I lost 9 years finding that out. But I got something neither of them will ever get back. I got to watch both of them lose everything a second time, while I was still standing on the one thing in my life that never once lied to me. I still teach lessons every morning. I still can't tell you with any real certainty whether I've gotten better at reading people or whether I've just gotten better at waiting one extra second before I decide. Some mornings those feel like the same thing. Some mornings they don't. The water still doesn't lie. Everything else you check twice. The water still doesn't lie. Everything else you check twice. Now, I have a question for all of you. What would you have done in my shoes? If you got that text from the person who ruined your life 9 years later, would you have helped or left them on red? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and follow/subscribe for more.